All right, let's dive into something I think, well, pretty much everyone has struggled with at some point. Why do those big resolutions, the ambitious goals like finally losing the weight or hitting the gym every single day, why do they so often just fizzle out?
Hmm.
It leaves you feeling like you just don't have enough willpower, right? You start strong, you're full of hope. Maybe you even drop like 7 pounds that first month. People are
Yeah,
noticing.
the initial burst.
Exactly. But then, poof, it just evaporates.
Yeah.
And it's super frustrating. And usually we end up just blaming ourselves.
It's such a common feeling. And what Professor Wendy Wood talks about in her book, Psychology of Habits, drawing on like decades of research, is that this whole cycle often comes from a really deep, almost universal misunderstanding of how lasting change actually happens.
Okay, so that's our mission for this deep dive then.
Yeah.
We want to unpack this idea that maybe sheer willpower isn't the secret ingredient we think it is. And instead, we're going to explore the maybe surprising role of habits. And crucially, how we can actually build them in a way that sticks for real sustainable change.
Yeah, and what's really fascinating is how Professor Wood, she's a psychology professor at USC, studied habits for over 30 years. She kind of flips our whole script on self-control.
Right, so let's start there with this willpower trap. Let's go back to our weight loss example. Someone decides this is it, they lose a bit of weight initially, then it just fades. Our first thought is usually, they lost their discipline.
Yep, classic interpretation.
And psychology historically has kind of backed this up, hasn't it? Like, think about the famous marshmallow experiment.
Oh, yeah.
It seemed to shout, self-control is king. Kids who could wait for the bigger reward, they tended to do better later in life. It really cemented this belief that strong willpower equals success.
That experiment definitely bolstered the traditional view, strong will, strong self-control, that leads to achievement. And lots of people trying to exert that control fall back on strategies of, well, self-denial.
Like telling yourself off.
Exactly, that internal voice saying, you're so fat, stop eating. Or maybe if you can't even control your weight, what can you control? It's like they're trying to use self-negation to strengthen their resolve, thinking that makes their will stronger.
Okay, so when we picture someone with amazing self-control, we often imagine them like constantly fighting off temptations, this epic inner battle they keep winning. That's the image, right?
That's the stereotype for sure.
But what did Professor Wood's research actually uncover about these super self-controlled people?
And this is where it gets really, really interesting. Her research found basically the opposite. Highly self-controlled people aren't actually better at resisting the urges. They simply seem to experience fewer urges to begin with.
Whoa, hold on. Fewer urges. That's huge. So it's not about gritting your teeth more. It's about having less to grit your teeth about. What does that mean for us? Are they just wired differently, or do they build something?
It points to this really critical shift in how we should think about it. Take exercise, for example. Someone just starting out, often there's this big internal battle, right?
Oh, yeah. Should I go? I'm tired. Maybe tomorrow.
Exactly. And during the workout, it's uncomfortable. You want to quit. You might blame weak willpower. But then you look at someone who exercises all the time. They don't usually have that debate. They just go.
Right. It's just part of their routine.
Precisely. And the key insight here is that self-control isn't really about having this iron will. It's about setting up stable patterns of behavior. In other words, it's about having good habits.
So this really knocks down the idea that habits are just, actions driven by willpower.
Yeah.
Professor Wood brings in this idea of two distinct selves inside us, which honestly makes a lot of sense when you think about it.
It really does. So you've got the conscious self. That's the part making choices, decisions, the part that's deliberately thinking and acting. It's the you that's actively listening to this right now. And then there's the unconscious or habitual self. This acts more like an autopilot system. It handles all the repetitive stuff without you needing to consciously think about it.
So when our dieter, who's trying so hard consciously, suddenly finds themselves halfway through a bag of chips while watching TV, that's not the conscious self failing.
Nope. That's the habitual self kicking in, running its old program in a familiar context.
Yeah.
It's not laziness or lack of desire from the conscious self. It's the autopilot taking the wheel.
And man, who hasn't done that? You look down and think, where did that go? It's so relatable.
Incredibly relatable. And this habitual self is running way more than just mindless snacking. Think about driving to work sometimes. You arrive and barely remember the journey, right?
Yeah, totally. Scary sometimes.
Or maybe you haven't used a certain dialect in years, but you visit home and boom, it just comes out. Or riding a bike after ages. That's all the habitual self doing its thing.
And it handles a lot. The book mentions some pretty staggering stats, like Habitual behaviors make up 88% of hygiene stuff, 55% of work tasks, 44% of exercise, even 48% of relaxation. Almost half our day is on autopilot.
It's massive, and we often wrongly credit the conscious self for what the habitual self is doing. We see disciplined people and think they're constantly exerting effort. But Wood says no, often they're just on autopilot. They're simply, as she puts it, better at cooperating with the other self.
That cooperation idea is interesting, and this ties into brain science too, right? It's about efficiency.
Exactly. From a neuroscience angle, it makes total sense. We have different brain circuits, repetitive actions in familiar settings. The brain shifts gears, engages this associative circuit. That's the habitual self's territory. Why? Because conscious thought, decision-making, it burns a lot of energy. The brain's incredibly efficient. It wants to save energy, so it offloads routine stuff to the habitual self. And that's precisely why trying to consciously control behavior long-term, like forcing yourself through sheer will every single time, is often just exhausting and unsustainable. It's too energy intensive.
So the goal isn't just forcing good habits, but getting these two selves to work together smoothly, like a good handoff.
Perfect analogy. Think about learning to drive. As a newbie, every single action, clutch, gear, check, mirror is conscious, deliberate, and frankly, exhausting.
Oh yeah, I remember that feeling.
But an experienced driver, often on complete autopilot, they might be thinking about dinner or listening to us, while the habitual self handles the driving. That's the ideal cooperation.
So the problem happens when there's a mismatch. Like, the conscious self tries to impose a new rule, no more snacks after 8 p.m., but then the familiar situation triggers the old habit and the autopilot takes over again.
Exactly. The habitual self reasserts control in those familiar cues and boom, relapse. And this is where the habitual self really shows its power, especially under pressure.
You mean like in sports or emergencies?
Precisely. Coaches drill athletes relentlessly on habits to eliminate confusion. Confusion means hesitation, mistakes. That USC football coach example is great training players, so their muscles just react automatically to game situations, whether it's one opponent or a whole team tackle. No time for conscious thought.
Muscle memory, essentially.
Yeah, built through habit. And firefighters, too. They face incredibly complex, dangerous situations. Research shows they make critical, split-second decisions not by consciously weighing options, but through subconscious reactions to cues. Smoke color, building layout, wind direction. Their habitual self is making those calls based on ingrained patterns.
Wow. Okay, so summing up this first part. Just relying on willpower, on trying harder, is likely not going to cut it for long-term change.
Right. It's often insufficient, maybe even counterproductive.
Real, lasting change seems to come from understanding this powerful habitual self and getting it to cooperate, getting our autopilot to work for us, not against us.
Exactly. It's about enabling that system.
Okay, so if we understand we've got these two selves, and habits run by the autopilot are key, the million-dollar question is, how do we actually build the good ones? Professor Wood lays out three key factors: environment, repetition, and reward.
Now, on the surface, that might sound kind of familiar, right? Environment, repetition, reward, basic stuff.
Yeah, seems standard.
But the way Professor Wood prioritizes and explains the nuances of these, especially environment, that's where the real insight lies.
So most people probably think repetition is the main thing, right?
Right.
Just do it over and over. That 21 days to form a habit idea is everywhere.
Oh, that 21-day myth. It's incredibly pervasive. People think, okay, 21 days, I'm golden, and if they miss a day, oh no, I've ruined everything.
And the author says that's just wrong.
Pretty much. First, she points out, missing a day occasionally doesn't derail the whole process, just get back on track. But more importantly, that 21 days number. It came from a surgeon in the 1960s observing how long it took patients to get used to, like, a new nose after plastic surgery.
Seriously, not habit formation research.
No. It was basically an anecdote, I guess, completely unrelated to forming behavioral habits like exercise or quitting smoking. And getting used to seeing a new face is very different from automating a daily action. Actual research shows habit formation time varies hugely. The average for simple stuff is closer to 66 days to feel automatic, not 21. And complex habits can take much, much longer.
66 days on average. Okay, that's a big difference. So repetition is involved, but maybe not the driver we think.
Exactly. Repetition plays a role, but Professor Wood argues its importance is often way overstated as the main thing. She says the most critical element, the foundation, is the environment.
The environment. Why that?
Because the environment provides the cues, the triggers, it sets the stage, like laying down the track for the habit train. The habitual self works on that perceive, signal, react loop. The environment provides the signal. Repetition then is more about smoothing out the journey on that track, making the reaction more automatic, not about forcing the track into existence by sheer will.
Okay, give us an example of environment being the key.
The U.S. smoking cessation story is a powerful one. Back in the 50s, the government knew smoking was bad, right? So they put warning labels on packs.
Yeah, I remember those.
But smoking rates stayed incredibly high. Nearly half the population still smoked by the early 70s. Why? Well, nicotine's addictive, sure. 68% wanted to quit, but fewer than 1 in 10 actually managed it. The warnings weren't changing the environment where people smoked.
So what changed?
The strategy shifted. In 1970, Nixon signed the Public Health Cigarette Smoking Act. This wasn't about warnings, it was about where you could smoke. Suddenly, you couldn't just light up anywhere, you might have to go downstairs, outside.
Oh, it changed the physical context.
Exactly. It added hassle. And this environmental shift had a dramatic impact. U.S. smoking rates started dropping significantly after that.
And we know it was the environment, not just other factors.
Well, the evidence is pretty strong. Comparing states with smoking bans versus states without them showed much lower smoking rates in the banned states. Like 9 of the 10 lowest smoking states had bans, the 3 highest didn't. It directly shows how changing the environment disrupted the habit.
How? By adding friction.
Precisely. Friction is the key concept here. Remember the perceive, signal, react loop of the habitual self. Changing the environment, making it inconvenient to smoke, introduced friction. It broke that automatic loop, forcing smokers to pause and make a conscious decision. Do I really want to go all the way outside for this?
That makes sense. Friction disrupts the autopilot.
Yeah, and we can use this deliberately. Want to break a bad habit? Add friction. Make it harder to do. Think about tech companies. They design apps for minimal friction, right? Easy scrolling, notifications, one-click buys. It keeps you hooked.
So do the opposite for bad habits.
Exactly. If you hate cooking, for example, prepping ingredients ahead of time or washing dishes immediately reduces the friction around the whole task, making it feel less daunting.
Okay, so environment can add friction to stop bad habits. Can it also push us towards good ones?
Absolutely. Environment provides driving force, too. It's just easier to settle down and read in a quiet library than a loud cafe, right? The environment pulls you towards focus.
Right.
A Chinese educator, Chen Haixian, calls this the field concept. Different environments are like fields filled with cues for specific behaviors. Bedroom, a mid-sleep field. Office, work field. Restaurant, eating field.
So if you want a certain habit, go into its field.
Basically, yes.
Right.
Or shape your environment to become that field. Struggling to study in your dorm room where you usually relax or sleep, go to the library, enter the study field. You're using the environment's driving force.
Okay, environment is key. Pillar 2 is reward. We know rewards work, right? Like Skinner's pigeons, dopamine hits.
Yeah, the basics are well known. Rewards release dopamine, feel good, make us want to repeat the action. But the critical factor Professor Wood highlights is the timing. The reward has to be pretty much immediate to strongly linked to the behavior.
So promising yourself a big reward weeks later doesn't really work for building the habit itself.
Not nearly as effectively. That student promised a fancy dinner 3 months after the exam. The reward is way too disconnected from the daily grind of studying to provide strong, ongoing motivation for those actions.
Okay, immediate rewards.
Yeah.
But you mentioned something even more powerful.
Yes. Even better than just immediate predictable rewards is what Wood calls uncertainty feedback. This is fascinating. Our brains are wired to get extra excited by the unknown, so rewards that are unexpected or unpredictable trigger a much bigger dopamine rush.
Ah, like gambling.
Exactly like gambling. The unpredictable nature of the win is what makes it so compelling. Or I think about our smartphones. Why do we check them constantly?
Because you never know what might be there. A new message, a notification, some interesting news.
Precisely. That constant potential for a novel, unexpected reward keeps us hooked. The uncertainty is addictive.
So if uncertainty is so powerful, could we use that deliberately, build unpredictable rewards into our good habits?
That's the provocative question, isn't it? How can you, listening now, engineer a little bit of positive uncertainty, a delightful surprise, into the habits you want to build? And a key point here, how do you know when it's actually a habit?
Right.
The true test, Wood says, is when you continue the behavior even without any external reward. It just feels normal, maybe even slightly uncomfortable not to do it. Until you reach that point, though, manipulating the environment and using immediate, hopefully uncertain rewards is crucial for getting the repetition needed.
Okay, environment, repetition, enabled by environment reward, and reward, immediate, ideally uncertain. Let's put it all together. How would this work for a really common struggle, like
Yeah.
spending too much time on your phone when you're trying to focus on work?
Great example. Okay, first, environment. If you're working alone at home, the phone field is probably strong. So change the field. Go work somewhere, public, a library, a co-working space. Just having other people around creates a subtle social pressure. Plus, the environment itself signals work time.
Makes sense. Then, friction.
Add lots of it for the phone. If you automatically reach for it, put it in a zipped pocket, or even better, in a bag across the room. Make getting it a hassle.
Okay.
For those super addictive apps, like social media, uninstall them. Force yourself to use the web browser version if you absolutely must. Those extra clicks add friction, and try to eliminate reasons to check it. Need the time. Get a cheap wristwatch. Need to chat for work. Use your computer. Keep the phone away.
Right. Remove the justifications.
Mhm.
And finally, reward. How do you get an uncertain reward instead of scrolling?
This is a clever one. Instead of grabbing your phone for that unpredictable dopamine hit from notifications, try this. When you feel the urge, use that moment to call a relative or a friend you haven't spoken to in a while.
Huh. How does that work?
Well, two things happen. First, it adds friction to just mindlessly using the phone for scrolling. Second, calling someone provides uncertainty feedback. You don't know exactly how the conversation will go, what you'll talk about, what news they'll share. It replaces the phone's unpredictable reward with a potentially more meaningful but still uncertain social reward. It flips the script.
That's actually brilliant. Using the urge itself to trigger a different positive, uncertain outcome. Okay, so this whole framework from psychology of habits really reframes things. Let's recap the big takeaways.
Yeah. First, long-term change. It's really built on habits, not just sheer willpower. Willpower fizzles.
Right. And habits are run by that powerful habitual self, our internal autopilot. Success means getting our conscious self and habitual self to cooperate.
Exactly. And the keys to building those habits are, number one, shape your environment. Add friction to block bad habits. Create driving force for good ones. Number two, repetition happens more easily within that supportive environment. And number three, use immediate and ideally uncertain rewards to lock in the behavior until it becomes automatic.
It's a really practical, less blame-focused approach. And it leads to a powerful final thought the author raises, doesn't it? About how we usually define change.
Yeah, this is quite profound. Traditionally, we think of change or self-improvement as pushing our upper limits, right? Striving to be better, faster, smarter, chasing genius or peak performance.
Trying to reach higher.
Exactly. But Professor Wood suggests another vital part of change is consistently raising our behavioral lower limit.
Raising the lower limit. What does that mean?
It means improving your baseline, making sure your worst performance is still pretty good. Think about great companies. They rely heavily on procedures, checklists, standardization.
To prevent mistakes.
Right. Or professional athletes, that they drill fundamentals relentlessly. They're not always trying to break records in practice. They're ensuring they don't make basic errors under pressure. They're raising the floor of their performance, not just the ceiling.
So high upper limits might be genius, but a high lower limit. That's professionalism.
That's a great way to put it. Genius might be flashy, maybe peaks and fades, but professionalism, that high lower limit, that's about consistency, reliability, minimizing errors. And that is something we can continuously work on, always optimize, always improve.
Wow. So maybe the real path to lasting change isn't always about huge leaps, but about focusing on those small, consistent improvements day after day.
Moving forward like an inchworm, as the saying goes, just consistently raising that baseline, making the good stuff more automatic, reducing the likelihood of slipping back. If you focus on that, on raising your lower limit day by day, well, the author suggests time will definitely reward that effort. It builds an incredibly strong foundation.